On the first episode of Infamous, as voted by you, we're going to take a look at the tragic story of the Stainer family of Merced, California. Before it starts, I just want to say a big thank you for donating, and I really hope you enjoy the podcast. Hayam Palm is a tiny town in the Trinity Mountains in Northern California. In 1960, Delbert Stainer was 27, and he worked in a sawmill in Hayam Palm. In that small town, which had only about 250 people, Delbert met Kay Augustine, and they got married. On August 13, 1961, Kay gave birth to their first child, a son named Cary. Not long after Cary's birth, the family moved to Merced, California. Delbert had suffered a back injury, and he couldn't work at the sawmill. He got a job as a maintenance man at a canning factory in Merced. On April 18, 1965, nearly 4 years after Cary was born, Kay gave birth to Stephen, their second child. Over the next 7 years, the family grew to include 3 daughters. Cary was an introverted child who didn't mind spending time alone. He enjoyed watching TV and doing artwork. Stephen was the complete opposite. He was an outgoing kid who had no problem talking to strangers. The family was a loving one, and while they did have some problems, as many large families do, they were happy. On the afternoon of December 4th, 1972, Stephen, who was 7, didn't come home from school. His parents called the police, and a massive search was launched. Christmas came and went, but no trace of Stephen was found. His parents became obsessed with finding him. They did their best to maintain their home life, but they felt they had to chase down any tips or leads about their missing son. After all, he may still be alive. Kenneth Parnell was born on September 26, 1931, in Amarillo, Texas. Times were tough when he was born. It was the beginning of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Parnell had 2 half-sisters and a half-brother. His mother was a fundamentalist Christian, and his father, who was an alcoholic, left the family when Parnell was 6. From a young age, Parnell showed signs that something was mentally wrong with him. For example, when he was a child, he tried to pull out his teeth with a pair of pliers. When Parnell was 13, his mother ran a boarding home in Bakersfield, California. One of the boarders who stayed at the home preyed on the disturbed young boy and sexually abused him. Parnell spent much of his teenage years at juvenile detention centers and psychiatric hospitals. When Parnell was 19, he pulled his car up to 3 boys who were walking in Bakersfield. He pretended to be a cop and then forced one of the boys to perform oral sex on him. He ended up serving 3.5 years for that sexual assault. After getting out of prison, Parnell made his way to Utah. In 1960, he robbed a gas station and he was arrested. He ended up serving 6 years in prison for the robbery. When he was paroled, he was told to leave Utah and never come back. Eventually, Parnell made his way back to California. He got a job at a lodge in Yosemite National Park as a night auditor. While working there, he befriended a man named Irvin Murphy. The two bonded over the fact that they both had been abused as children. Parnell told Murphy that he was studying to be a preacher. He also told him that several children living in nearby Merced, California, were being abused. Parnell said that he wanted to save one of these children from the abuse and raise him as his own son. Over the course of several days, starting in early December 1972, Parnell and Murphy drove to Merced and watched children walk home from school. One boy caught Parnell's attention. One day on his way home from school, the boy talked to a mailman. By listening to the conversation, Parnell learned that the boy's name was Stephen, and he had recently been spanked by his parents. Parnell decided that he would be the one. On December 4th, Murphy approached Steven Stainer as he walked home from school. Murphy told the outgoing 7-year-old that he was with the church and he wanted to know if Steven's mother had any gifts she would like to donate. Steven said she probably did. Murphy told him that the preacher could drive him to his house to pick up the gifts. Steven got in Parnell's car and they drove straight by his house and kept going. Parnell took the boy to his remote cabin. He told Steven that his parents had lost custody of him because they could no longer afford him. During his first week in captivity, Steven begged to go home. But after a while, Steven started to believe Parnell. Parnell and Steven stayed in the cabin for 2 weeks before moving away. They drifted for a while before ending up near Ukiah, California. Parnell told Steven that his new name was Dennis Gregory Parnell and he should call him Dad. Parnell even enrolled Steven in school. For the next 7 years, they lived together, and everyone thought that they were father and son. What was really happening was that Parnell was sexually abusing Steven. He would also shower Steven with gifts and allowed him to do whatever he wanted. At a young age, Steven started to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, and smoke marijuana. 7 years would go by, and they were long ones for the Stainer family. They had no idea that their son was alive and living about 250 miles away from them. As Steven got into his teens, Parnell lost interest in him sexually. He tried to get Steven to help him kidnap another child, but Steven refused to help out. Instead, Parnell enlisted the help of one of Steven's friends, 14-year-old Randall Porman, who went by his middle name, Sean. Sean met Steven at school, and in early 1980, Sean was crashing at Parnell's. Parnell told Steven that he wanted to build a new family and he needed a child. Parnell offered Sean $50, some marijuana, and 2 bottles of Jack Daniel's whiskey if he would help him kidnap a child. Amazingly, Sean agreed to help. On February 13, 1980, they spotted 5-year-old Timothy White walking home from school in Ukiah. His class had celebrated Valentine's Day that afternoon. Sean grabbed Timothy and dragged him kicking and screaming into the car. Once in the car, they gave him some orange juice laced with crushed up sleeping pills, and Timothy fell asleep. As he did with Steven 7 years earlier, Parnell told Timothy that his parents could no longer afford him. He also said that he was his new father and he should call him Dad. 2 weeks later, Parnell left the cabin to go work his shift as a night security guard. After he left, Steven took Timothy and they hitchhiked to Ukiah. Eventually, they went to the police station and Steven told the police who he really was. He told them he didn't want Timothy to suffer the same abuse that he did. Hours later, both Timothy and Steven were reunited with their families. Parnell was arrested, as were Irvin Murphy and Sean Porman. Murphy was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Sean was sent to a reform school. Parnell was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and he served only 5 years. He was released in April 1985, and by 1988, he had finished his parole. After Steven returned home, he encountered several problems when trying to readjust to life with his family. While living with Parnell, Steven was allowed to do anything he wanted. This included drinking and smoking. Also, because of his experiences, Steven was a lot more grown up than his actual 14 years. When Steven's parents last saw him, he was 7 years old, so they still thought of him as a child. This led to a lot of overparenting of a child who didn't feel that he needed that type of attention. What may have also contributed to the problems is that Steven's father didn't think that he needed any therapy. So besides some short-term counseling after he escaped, Steven never got professional help. He He never talked to anyone about his sexual abuse. His school life wasn't much better than his home life. Other children would tease him because he had been sexually abused. Stephen eventually dropped out of school and he continued to drink. At one point, he was even kicked out of his parents' home. By 1985, the same year that Parnell was released from prison, Stephen was 20 and he had started to turn his life around. He got married that year and he and his wife went on to have 2 children. Having his own children, Stephen saw his kidnapping in a new light. He started to volunteer with organizations that search for missing children, and he started talking to school children. He was also an advisor for a TV miniseries that was made about his life called I Know My First Name is Stephen.
Did you kidnap Timmy White?
No.
Then who did? Then who did?
My dad.
Your father?
He's not my father. He did the same thing to me when I was a kid.
What?
He just took me. I was on my way home from school. I was 7. I know my first name is Stephen. I think my last name is Stainer.
I Know My First Name is Stephen aired for the first time in 1989. Not long after it aired, on September 17, 1989, Stephen was driving his motorcycle home from the Pizza Hut where he worked in Merced. He slammed into the back of a stalled vehicle and suffered a head injury. Sadly, he didn't survive the accident. Stephen Stainer was just 24 years old when he died. 10 years after Stephen was killed, in February 1999, 42-year-old Carol Sudd of Eureka, California, was planning a short camping trip. Her friend, who lived in Argentina, had sent her 16-year-old daughter, Silvina Peloso, to live with Carol and her family for 3 months. Silvina was set to go back to Argentina, and Carol wanted to do one last outing before sending her back. Going along for the trip was Carol's 15-year-old daughter, Julie, who had grown close to Silvina. The plan was to go hiking in the Yosemite Valley. They drove their rental car to the Cedar Lodge, which is just outside of Yosemite, near El Portal, California. On February 15th, the trio went hiking and then retired to their room at the Cedar Lodge to watch a movie. When they didn't return home after their trip, their family reported them missing. Searches were launched, but they couldn't find the women or their car. A month later, a burned-out car was found in the mountains of Yosemite. In the trunk of the car were the charred, unrecognizable remains of 2 people. Using dental records, the bodies were identified as Carol's son and Silvina Peloso. 6 days after their bodies were found, the police received an anonymous letter. It contained a crudely drawn map and some handwriting. The handwriting said, "We had fun with this one." The police followed the map and found the body of Julie about an hour's drive away from the rental car. Her throat had been slit so severely that her head was nearly severed. The police thought that the killer, or killers, were meth heads, so arrests were made and people thought that the park was safe again. 26-year-old Joey Ruth Armstrong lived on a remote edge of Yosemite, not far from the Cedar Lodge where Carol's son, her daughter, and her friend's daughter were last seen alive. Armstrong lived in a cabin that didn't have running water or electricity with her boyfriend and a roommate. Armstrong was a naturalist, and she worked at the Yosemite Institute. On the evening of July 21st, 1999, about 5 months after the 3 women were killed, Armstrong was planning on taking a road trip to visit a friend. Her boyfriend and her roommate were both gone for the weekend. When she didn't show up at her friend's home, her friend alerted the authorities. Park rangers went to her home and found her truck packed off for her weekend trip. Not far from her cabin, in a ditch with 3 feet of water, was the body of Armstrong. She had been decapitated. Her head was found about 40 feet away in the same ditch. The police interviewed witnesses, and several people saw a truck, a 1979 Blue Scout, near the cabin. The police quickly traced the truck back to a maintenance man at the Cedar Lodge, Cary Stayner. Cary Stayner is, of course, Steven Stayner's older brother. Cary was brought in for questioning, and he confessed to the 4 murders. He said that on the night that he killed the 3 women, he pretended that there was a leak in their washroom. Since he was the maintenance man, they let him into the room. He walked out of the washroom holding a gun, which was, unknown to the women, not loaded. He tied up all 3 of his victims on the bed. He brought Carol into the washroom and strangled her to death with a rope. He carried her body out to her car and put her in the trunk. He then went back into the room and sexually assaulted the teenage girls. He also forced them to perform sex acts on each other. 5 or 6 hours later, Cary brought Sylvania into the washroom. He strangled her and then placed her body in the trunk of Carol's rented car. He went back into the room and sexually assaulted Julie again. After doing so, he picked her up, and like a groom carrying his bride, he took her out to the car, which contained the dead bodies of her mother and her friend. He drove her out to the area where her body would be found and slit her throat. He ditched the car, then went back a few days later and set the car on fire. 5 months after killing the 3 women, Cary happened upon Joey Armstrong as she was loading up her truck. He struck up a friendly conversation with her, and when he realized that she was alone, he pulled out his gun. He bound her with duct tape and got her into his truck. As he was driving away, Armstrong jumped out of the moving vehicle. Cary chased her down and tackled her. He put his knife under her chin and slit her throat. He kept cutting until her head came off. After his confession, the police collected a lot of physical evidence tying him to the 4 murders. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His family took the stand and testified about his troubled childhood. When Steven went missing, Cary and his sisters felt ignored. It seemed like their parents' attention and most of their thoughts were consumed with Steven. After Steven came back, Cary said he again felt ignored, but in a different way. Steven got a lot of attention from his parents, and Steven was a bit of a celebrity. After Steven died, Cary went into a deep depression. Besides dealing with his brother, Cary was also sexually abused by an uncle when he was a young boy. The problem with Cary's defense was what he said in his confession to the FBI. He said that he had violent fantasies about killing people as early as the age of 7, which was 4 years before Steven was kidnapped. He also did a lot of things to cover up the fact that he killed the 3 women, which showed that he was mentally aware of what he was doing. Cary Stayner was found guilty of all 4 murders, and he was sentenced to death. The 4 murders may not be the only ones he committed. Cary said that he never killed anyone before he killed the 3 women, but one of his uncles, who Cary was living with at the time, was found murdered, and his case has never been solved. 42-year-old Jesse Stainer was killed in his home in December 1990. He had been shot once in the chest with his own gun. Carey had an alibi for the time of the murder, and he wasn't considered a suspect at the time, but the police think it's possible that he may have shot his uncle. Carey Stainer is currently on death row at San Quentin State Prison. One would hope that this would be the end of the sad, terrible saga, but it wasn't. In late 2002 and early 2003, Kenneth Parnell was in his early 70s and he was confined to a wheelchair. He needed around-the-clock supervision from a nurse in his apartment in Berkeley, California. He asked one of those nurses if she could get a 4-year-old boy for him. He would pay $100 for the birth certificate and $400 for the boy. The nurse immediately went to the police and they set up a sting. Parnell was arrested when he paid for a fake birth certificate provided by the police. The district attorney successfully argued that this arrest was Parnell's third strike, so he was sentenced to life in prison. Kenneth Parnell died on January 21, 2008, at the age of 76. Finally, there is Timothy White, the second boy that Parnell kidnapped. On April 1, 2010, he suffered a pulmonary embolism and died. He was just 36 years old. Thanks a lot for listening to the first podcast. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. Also, try to think of more cases for next month, and we'll have another vote. But that's all. Thanks again for listening.